Thank you so much for coming. I'm Gail Safian. I'm the president of the Durand-Hedden House. And we are thrilled that you're all here today to hear the esteemed Rebecca Roberts, who is an award-winning educator and speaker, a leading historian of women's suffrage and civic participation. And one of her award-winning books is called The Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World. And on the walls of the Durand-Hedden House, which I hope you will go to after this program, we have reception there for you with refreshments. And we also, on the walls of the house, we have an exhibit about the fight for women's suffrage, which is so important, and it never seems to not be important. So right now, Rebecca is Deputy Director of Events at the Library of Congress, and she served on several boards, and she's on the Editorial Advisory Committee of the White House Historical Association. So please welcome Rebecca Boggs.
Thanks so much, Gail, and thank you all so much for being here and inviting me to come talk about Edith Wilson and Women's History Month, although I remind you, you can talk about women's history all 12 months of the year. It doesn't just after you march. So Edith Wilson, if you know one thing about her, and maybe you know nothing about her at all, but if you know one thing about her, you know that in 1919, when Wilson suffered a stroke, she stepped in, and to the degree that anybody was acting as the executive at that point in our nation's history, it was Edith Wilson. It was Edith who was taking meetings and reviewing legislation and issuing statements and making decisions about the cabinet. And it went on for a shockingly long time, and it was unprecedented before or since. So if you only take that one chapter of her and her history, she gets kind of reduced to a stock character. You know, no one's defined by one moment of their lives. And if you just take those 6 months from October of 1919 through the spring of 1920, she gets written about as sort of one of three characters. Either she's, you know, a naive country mouse who was taken advantage of by savvy political men who used her as a puppet. Not true. Or maybe she was the opposite. Maybe she was Lady Macbeth, and she had a political agenda of her own, and she saw her opportunity and she seized it to advance her own priorities. That is slightly more true, but still not the whole story. Or maybe she was just being the best Mrs. Woodrow Wilson she could be. And maybe she was putting her husband before the country, but how could you really blame her for standing by her man and putting his life and his priorities foremost in her mind, rather than really thinking through the constitutional repercussions of what she was doing. Maybe her priorities weren't exactly the way they should have been, but you can't help but admire her for being such an incredibly loyal wife. The tricky part about that third characterization is that the biggest proponent of it was Edith herself. She threw up a ton of smoke and mirrors over the years to try to make it so that the narrative we all received about that era was her standing by her man. She wrote a memoir. It's delightful. It's funny. It's frank. It's super gossipy. It is also in places like demonstrably untrue, because she was so invested in telling this version of events and downplaying her role in history. Like, who writes a whole memoir to downplay their role in history? You know, like, no man ever. So to get to her real story, you have to get behind her own smoke and mirrors. She's an unreliable narrator of her own life, which is tricky. But once you take the time to learn who she really was, what she did in 1919 comes as no surprise whatsoever. She telegraphed over and over again what kind of a person she was. So who was she? I love to start with this picture. She's about 3 years old in this picture, and doesn't she look super grouchy? I suspect she is grouchy because she's wearing pants. This is the only picture I've ever seen of her not beautifully and very femininely dressed. I also suspect the pants were hand-me-downs. She was the 6th of 9 kids. And she was born in 1872, so Reconstruction era in Wytheville, Virginia. Wytheville is in that skinny southwest corner of Virginia in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And actually, can you advance the slide, please? This is Edith's childhood home, and I took this picture from the roof of the hotel across the street. And I love it for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is not the way the Bowling family expected they would be raising their family. The Bowlings very proudly trace their descent directly from Pocahontas. Edith goes through 9 generations in her memoir to prove that she was descended from a princess. And before the Civil War, they were planters in the James River Valley. They were enslavers. And when that economy was upended, they could no longer afford to live that way. And so they moved to Wytheville, to this funny little property that Judge Bowling, Edith's father, had as a rental. And you can see the final building in the row is not part of it. So it's the first 3 storefronts on the street level. And now those are Skeeter's hot dogs and a coffee shop and a little museum dedicated to Edith. And then the second level is the family home. And then the third level is a false gable. So everybody was crammed in that funny second level. And it's a rabbit warren. Like the rooms don't connect to each other. You have to go downstairs to go upstairs. And there were 9 kids, and the parents, and both grandmothers, and an aunt, and a cousin, and various law students who would show up, and family members who would overstay their welcome, and a couple of dogs, and 26 canaries, and there was a lot going on in that house. The other reason I like to show this picture is the mountains are right there, right? She's still our only Appalachian First Lady. So Edith grows up in the midst of this chaos in this house, and she was fed from the cradle these lost cause myths, right? This is not the manner to which we should have been born. We had a gracious and wonderful life before the Yankees took it all away. We have come down in the world because they didn't understand what the South should be, and perhaps we will rise again. She easily could have gotten lost in that shuffle, as you might imagine, with all those people. Next slide. But as it happened, one of her grandmothers, her father's mother, Mrs. Bowling, looked at that raft of grandchildren and, for reasons known only to herself, picked Edith out as a favorite. It was a mixed blessing. Grandmother Bowling was, as far as I can tell, terrifying. She had, as a young woman, been thrown from a horse and was more or less paralyzed. So she stayed in the home and sort of held court from this rocking chair throne. The item on the back of that rocking chair is the tanned skin of a dead dog. It's so gothic and creepy, isn't it? And she insisted on wearing, Civil War era hoop skirts long after they were out of fashion. She had, mourning brooch of human hair. It keeps going. And she was mean as a snake, but she picked Edith out and said, "You are smart. You are capable. You are my favorite. You have to take care of my canaries," which Edith hated. She writes in her memoir that the only time she liked the canaries was when one died. And she and her brother Will were allowed to put on like elaborate bird funerals. So Grandmother Bowling taught Edith academically. She taught her how to sew. She taught her a kind of homemade French. But she also taught her confidence and taught her that she was capable of great things. That was not a message a lot of girls were getting in 1872 in Wytheville, Virginia, right? It, in fact, wasn't even the message Edith was getting from her other grandmother, who also lived with them. Her other grandmother, her mother's mother, was very much part of that Victorian cult of true womanhood message where girls were supposed to be pious and submissive and domestic and pure. So I don't really think it's fair to psychoanalyze her 150 years after her birth, but I do think that a lot of what Edith did and who she was can be explained by the contradiction in those early lessons. By nature, she was much more bent towards the confident, I can do great things lesson, but she spent a lot of time pretending she wasn't and giving other people credit and sweeping it under the rug. Next slide. This is Edith as a teenager. Isn't she lovely? Can you imagine what sort of tree is going on under there to keep her waist that size? So this is Edith as a teenager. She was largely educated at home. She did go to school for 2 semesters, one to a boarding school in Abingdon, Virginia. She hated it. She went home. Then she was sent to a boarding school in Richmond, Virginia, and she loved that. She loved Richmond. It was bustling. There were these sophisticated city girls, and she sort of saw, you know, a world beyond Wytheville and the Canaries. And Richmond post-Civil War literally was rebuilding because it had burned. And so it was leapfrogging some interesting technology. They had an electric streetcar, which no city in America did. And she just kind of loved that hustle and bustle. And then the headmaster of the school actually got hit by a streetcar. And beware of technology. And the school closed and the girls were all sent home. And the next fall, when she was about to turn 18, and the conversation sort of went to, does Edith go back to school? What happens? She was the 6th kid. Kids 7, 8, and 9 were all boys. And the family couldn't afford to keep educating a girl. So that was it. She was done with education. And what do, right? She didn't want to stay in Wytheville. She didn't want to marry any of her neighbors. And she had an older sister who had married a man named Alexander Galt and moved to Washington, D.C. And they had a baby. And the excuse was, Edith can come take care of the baby. So in 1890, she moves to Washington. So 1890s Washington is booming Gilded Age Washington, right? There was, I'm going to go down a little tangent here because you all are history buffs. Post-Civil War, there was real talk about moving the capital, right? DC did not fare well in the Civil War. It was actively fortified. It was actively overtaken by a population it was not prepared to withstand. It had never really had paved roads or, public works in a way that could sustain that kind of a boom. And after the Civil War, when it was sort of a mess, but also there was this feeling that, to honor this newly reunited nation, maybe the capital should be in St. Louis. Maybe it should be someplace more central than had been when it was just 13 colonies. And in order to combat that effort, the city fathers of DC embarked on a huge building program. And they paved the streets, and they added a sewer system, and they built a streetcar system, and they built public lighting, and it just boomed. And so much wealth was coming into Washington. And it was a time when, Washington still, social turnover comes and goes with administrations to some degree. There are those of us who are local, but there are others who come and go. And so if you had a kind of parvenu, Gilded Age fortune, you could break into Washington society in a way you couldn't in New York or Boston. Mrs. Astor's ballroom was not for you, but Washington, there was a moment where a gossip columnist said it was as fashionable to have a winter house in Washington as it was to have a summer house in Newport. Edith Wharton and Mark Twain have characters in their books of that era that go to Washington because the social strictures are less tight. So that was the Washington Edith moved to. She didn't have any money, so she wasn't, flouncing around the Gilded Age parties, but she was experiencing that boom and seeing what a vibrant urban life could be like. And she went to the theater all the time, and she mastered the streetcar system, which was horse-drawn streetcars and very weird. And she never, ever, ever wanted to go back to Wytheville. And so, next picture, please. She kind of looked around, and her brother-in-law, Alexander Galt, had a cousin named Norman Galt. And Norman owned Galt's jewelry store. I understand the Durands were also people who made jewelry and silver. So the local Tiffany's of Washington for 200 years was a store called Galt's. And that was Norman's store. And Norman, poor Norman, he seems like he was a perfectly nice guy. Edith dismisses him in like a page and a half in her memoir. But he was the owner of this high-end business, and he was an upstanding citizen. He was on the Chamber of Commerce, and he was on the vestry of his church, and he was a good guy. Maybe a little stuffy. He apparently changed his shirt 3 times a day, and he was significantly older than Edith, and she's so dismissive of him and his feelings. But they were married for 12 years, and he was her ticket out of Wytheville. They had one child who didn't survive, and Then in 1908, he died, and he left the jewelry store to her. Which, think about that, in 1908, a woman owning a prosperous business, she's a widow, so she doesn't need a chaperone, she has no children, Norman's father is dead, so he can't contest her taking over this business. So she had wealth and control over her own wealth and a status of independence and authority that was really rare for women in 1908. And she was really good at it. Next picture. She became the first woman of this. They lived in this townhouse on DuPont Circle. It doesn't exist anymore. And this is a duplex. They lived on my right-hand side. And, you know, it's not huge, but it's sort of urban and sophisticated, what she was imagining when she was at school in Richmond and coming to Washington. And next picture. She became the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. Let me tell y'all, I felt so deep down a rabbit hole of electric cars because she talks about it in her memoir, that she drove her little electric. And it turns out, and I don't know if y'all can see the picture, it's steered by like a tiller on the bench seat. It's sort of a golf cart that looks like a buggy, top speed 13 miles an hour. And because these electric cars were so much less smelly and you didn't have to crank them and all the stuff that was difficult about early gas cars, women loved them. And car manufacturers figured that out and started marketing them to sophisticated urban women. And they had bud vases on the dash. And Edith usually had an orchid in hers. Edith was devoted to orchids. There are later pictures where she's wearing a corsage, you know, the size of a dinner plate. And in fact, when Woodrow Wilson first fell in love with her, he said, "You are the only woman I know who can wear an orchid. On everyone else, the orchid wears the woman." I cannot pull off the corsage you can see from space, but I do wear a little orchid lapel pin when I talk about Edith. So that's who she was, this sophisticated, wealthy widow, control of her own money. She's driving her little electric car around town. And if you read other memoirs of the time, like Alice Roosevelt Longworth or Ellen Morey Sladen, other Washington hostesses, they all talk about Mrs. Galt and her electric car. She was a thing. She went to Europe every year. She bought her gowns at the House of Worth. She was beautiful and beautifully dressed and sophisticated. Meanwhile, what's the next picture? There's one more of her this era.
Go next.
Yes, please. Yes, so this is her at this era. This picture is actually the cover of my book, and I believe this dress was probably white, but the publisher tinted it Tiffany blue for the book cover, which I love. There's a later picture I'll show you that is often the cover of books about Edith, where she's sort of hovering over Woodrow's shoulder, and I get why people use that because of the symbolism of her watching over him, but I love this kind of shoulders back, looking to the future, you know, chin up, independent Edith. Next picture. Meanwhile, up here in New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, as I'm sure you all know, he was not a politician, he was an academic. He worked his way up through several professorial jobs, ended up at Princeton. From my right, again, that's his daughter Jessie, his first wife Ellen, daughter Nell, daughter Margaret. Nope, I'm confused, Margaret and Jessie. First one's Margaret, Ellen, Nell, Jessie, Wilson. Wilson became president of Princeton. He picked a fight with the dean, he lost. He was already sort of on the outs with a lot of the alumni and administration at Princeton, but he was recruited to run for governor of New Jersey in 1910. He won, takes office in 1911, runs for president in 1912. So he had been in politics for like a minute and a half when he became president of the United States. And I don't know if you all remember, the election in 1912 was the year that William Howard Taft was the Republican incumbent, but Teddy Roosevelt challenged him on a third-party ticket, the Bull Moose ticket. They split the Republican vote. When elected, Wilson was the one who had won the primaries, and he did have a reputation for reform, and he had bucked the local machine in New Jersey, and he did have support, but it was a kind of accidental presidency in some ways. When the Wilson family came to Washington for inauguration in 1913, it was just not their natural habitat. You know, they had come from academia. Ellen in particular, the ceremonial public side of First Lady did not come easily to her. She was a great academic wife, and she was an accomplished painter of some renown. But the Washington press made fun of her hair and made fun of her clothes, and she was dowdy, and she, you know, got too much sun, and the daughters had too many teeth, and the gossip columns were vicious about them. And Ellen really wanted no part of that hostessing side of First Ladying anyway. The daughters were all in their 20s at that point. They all came to town too, and they were better at it and more interested in it. But both Jesse and Nell, the two younger of the three, got married that first year he was in the White House. Jessie moved to Williamstown, Massachusetts. Her husband was a professor at Williams. Nell stayed in town because, in a big scandal, she married Wilson's Secretary of Defense, who had children younger than her, children older than her, but she moved out of the White House, but she stayed in town. Margaret, the oldest, was a soprano and was trying to make a career as a singer. Ellen Wilson died in 1914. And by all accounts, Woodrow was heartbroken. They had been married for over 30 years. They had raised this family together. She had been his closest confidant. And Wilson was never the most robust dude to begin with. He always had health issues. His vision kind of suffered damage. He always had digestive issues, which he described in, elaborate ways, which I won't share with you. And when Ellen died and he was depressed, his doctor was frankly worried about him. And his doctor, who I think is in the next slide, to be advanced, a guy named Carrie Grayson, was a friend of Edith's. And so Carrie Grayson went to Edith and said, listen, Ellen is dead, 2 of the daughters are out of the house, the 3rd daughter is trying to make a go of it as a singer. Wilson's cousin, a woman named Helen Bones, who had come to Washington with them in order to be Ellen's social secretary, is sort of stuck alone in this depressing White House. The president's depressed, she's in mourning, no one else is there to help her. Go make friends with Helen Bones. Be nice, do a good thing. And Edith said, no, I don't want to be part of the White House, that's not my scene. I'm part of non-federal Washington. I don't want to show up at the White House and make friends with Helen Bones. I think the next picture actually has Helen. Yeah, that's Helen. And then Dr. Grayson in the middle, and Nell Wilson McAdoo, the youngest daughter, there at the races. So Helen was sort of left holding the First Lady bag, no one else was around. And there wasn't a lot going on socially because the White House was in mourning, but to the degree that anybody was First Ladying, it was Helen. So finally, Carrie Grayson convinces Edith to go be nice, and it turns out she actually liked Helen, and they enjoyed each other's company. And what they would mainly do together is go for long walks in Rock Creek Park. And then they would go back to that townhouse I showed you a picture of and have tea. And this is now the beginning of 1915, February 1915. One day in March of 1915, Helen says, come back to the White House for tea instead. And Edith says, no, my boots are all muddy, we've been walking in the park, I'm not showing up at the White House like this. And Helen says, actually, I insist. I'm always the guest, please let me repay the hostess role. No one will see you. We'll just go in the private elevator, we'll go straight up to the family quarters, the president's playing golf. He apparently, by the way, was a terrible golfer, but Dr. Grayson would constantly try to get him out on the course to get him healthy. Grayson also was apparently a terrible golfer. And Helen Bones said, just come. It'll be fine, no one will see you. Don't worry about your boots. It was a total setup. She goes to the White House, they go up the private elevator, the doors open, there's the president and Carrie Grayson, right off the golf course. As Edith says, their golf clothes were not smart. They invite her to stay for tea, they all have tea together, and the president is a goner from that moment on. And we know that because their love letters survive. Now, as Gail mentioned, I'm a historian of the suffrage era. When you study the suffrage era, you don't learn to say a lot of nice things about Woodrow Wilson. But he cultivated that, intellectually superior aspect. He's still our only president with a PhD. He was righteous to the point of priggish. He saw things very much in moral terms. He was very bookish and nerdy. And let me tell you, that man wrote racy love letters. Like, who knew Woodrow Wilson had it in him? But you get to the point, even reading his mail, 100 years later, you get kind of blushy and embarrassed. Like, damn, Woodrow? So these letters are fantastic because he, from the beginning, from March of 1915, he's just laying his heart on the line. And you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and I want to kiss your eyelids, and I know, right? And equally fantastic, she is writing back from the very beginning, saying, okay, that's nice. Listen, do you think William Jennings Bryan is going to resign as Secretary of State? Who do you think is going to take his place? So Edith, in her memoir, maintained that she was not political. It's garbage. She loved this stuff, and she was good at it, and her instincts were actually really spot on. And from the beginning of these letters, he's going gushy-gushy, and she's going political inside gossip. 6 weeks after they met, he proposed for the first time. She turned him down. She said, we don't even know each other that well. Your wife just died. Like, I'm willing to keep dating, but I'm not going to marry you. The morning after he proposed, he writes her this letter that, again, super ardent. I've never seen a female form of such perfection, on and on. And she writes back, your last letter to the Germans about sinking the Lusitania was not your best work. I really think you should have me edit your stuff. He finally figured it out, that talking to her about politics was a surer way to her heart. He didn't stop with the kiss your eyelid stuff. In fact, there's one letter, the one that kills me the most is, they were still keeping up the pretense that she was Helen's friend, that they weren't dating. And so at one point she went to tea with Helen and some other ladies, and they sat on the White House lawn. And he snuck into the green room and spied on her through the lace curtains. He's the president of the United States. World War I is heating up in Europe, and he's like sneaking a peek at his girlfriend and writes her this letter about, you were so brilliant to sit where I could see you, and I had such a good view of you through the lace curtains of the green room. Yeah, it's stunning. So finally, throughout the summer of 1915, he starts accompanying his letters with big packets of diplomatic correspondence and pending legislation and drafts of public statements. He taught her his cipher so that she could decode messages from his advisors abroad. Like, national security be damned, I want my girlfriend to know what's going on. And so many times a day, messengers would take packets of information between the White House and her house in DuPont Circle. And it started to work. Policy analysis was the way to even start. So by fall of 1915, she said to him, I'll marry you if you lose re-election in 1916. I don't want to be first lady. I don't want people to think I'm ambitious for the office. She said, I want to marry the man, not the president. He seems to have really only heard, I'll marry you, and started telling everyone they were engaged. Next picture. This is what the Washington Post published when they got wind of the romance. They got married at the end. Finally, she says, okay, win or lose, I'm in. We're going to get married. They got married at the end of 1915, December of 1915, at her house, not his house. 1916 dawns, and now it's an election year. Can we stipulate that First Lady is kind of a bonkers job, right? There's no job description. In some ways, you're supposed to reflect ideal American womanhood, whatever the hell that is. You can sort of learn from your predecessors, but you also have to shape the narrative yourself. And if you come up through the ranks with the candidate and you kind of learn how to be a political spouse as you go. It's still weird, but at least you've got an on-ramp. Edith became First Lady overnight into an election year. Turned out she was actually pretty good at campaigning. I think there's a campaign picture next. She never gave interviews, and she never championed a cause the way First Ladies had done before her and certainly did after her. But she showed up everywhere. One of the reasons she was resistant to marry him was that she knew once she did, she'd be all in. And she shook every hand, and she made every host feel important, and she smoothed the way for him. He was actually shy and a little socially awkward and didn't want to be in a position where he looked like he was doing something wrong. And she, who had never really known what she was doing as a teenager in Washington, as a small business owner, as a car driver, and just sort of counted on her own confidence to get her through, would just make it all nice for him. He did win re-election in 1916, not by a whole lot, but he squeaked by. Then 1917, now the US is involved in World War I. Being a wartime First Lady is a whole other ball of bonkers, right? And she was good at that too. She was particularly good at the collective sacrifice side of First Ladying, the public example. She did all the meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. She had sheep grazing the White House lawn to free up the landscape crew to do war work. But also the sheep were very visible. You drove by the White House and you saw sheep, and you remembered that they were making sacrifices too. When the sheep had to be sheared, she auctioned off the wool to benefit the Red Cross. She was good at that kind of political example. She volunteered at the Red Cross, all that. When the war ended, at the end of 1918, Wilson insisted on going to the peace talks in person. That was controversial at the time, in part because no president had really been away for very long. Teddy Roosevelt had left for an afternoon to go, inspect the Panama Canal. That was about it. And he was going to be gone for months and months. But also, making treaties is messy work, and compromises need to be made. And there was some feeling that he could maintain the moral high ground if he stayed back in Washington, let his diplomats and cabinet secretaries negotiate the ugly parts, and then he could, sort of rule from on high. But he was never going to let that happen, because his whole justification for U.S. involvement in World War I was to have a say in the peace. We didn't have territory at stake, right? We didn't have an existential threat. His whole priority was this notion of a League of Nations, a collective security agreement to prevent World War from ever happening again. And for his vision of global peace, he was going to be at the table to negotiate it himself. Well, where he went, she went. Next picture. So they both go to Paris in 1918. And they were gone the better part of 6 months. They came home briefly in March to close the last Congress and open the next one, but they were really gone. And very much on the world stage, of course, including Edith. Now we think of that international public diplomacy role as very much part of what the First Lady did, but she hadn't before. And they are heroes, right? I think the next picture is of them in a parade down the Champs-Élysées. Edith describes this in her memoir. So many people threw flowers that she was worried they were going to sort of die by rose suffocation. So they started pitching the bouquets out of the buggy. But her picture is suddenly everywhere because it's, of course, the biggest news story anywhere in the world. And there she is. So she's dining at Buckingham Palace. She's getting the key to the city of Rome. She is there while the treaty negotiations go on, and people start to realize she's the back door to him. This is when they finally realize that she knows exactly what is going on with him politically, and if they have something that they need to bend his ear on, she's the gatekeeper. He also got really sick in Paris. It was 1918. There was a flu. And because he couldn't play golf and have someone watching over his diet in the way that kept him healthy in Washington, he got very, very sick. By the time the treaty was agreed on, he was pretty frail. They come back early summer of 1919, and now he's got to sell the treaty to the Senate. The Democrats had lost control of both the House and Senate in the 1918 midterms. And there were a fair number of senators in office who just were never going to give a Democratic president a win, right? There's the change. There were other Republican senators who were willing to compromise on the treaty, but they were particularly concerned about the League of Nations because they thought that it took the authority to declare war away from the Congress. Because if we were bound by a security agreement to defend our allies, then no longer was it up to Congress to declare war. And they wanted to find some middle ground on that. Wilson would not compromise. He wanted a yes or no vote on the treaty. No terms were open for debate. No compromise was on the table. Absolutely up or down. That was it. So he and the Senate are deadlocked throughout the summer of 1919. By the fall of 1919, Wilson decides the only way he's going to get this treaty through is by taking it to the people and convincing them of the beauty and justice of the League of Nations, and then they'll put pressure on their own elected officials. Well, it's an era before mass communications. If you want to take a message to the people, you get on a train and you go to the people. Well, that was a terrible idea. This man was already quite sick. You don't take an exhausted, frail person and stick him on a 100-degree metal train car and truck him around the nation to shake hundreds of hands a day and give dozens of speeches. And everyone tried to talk him out of it. Edith, Carrie Grayson, his doctor, Joe Tumulty, whose title was secretary but functioned as the chief of staff. And Wilson would not hear of being talked out of this. In some ways, he loved the idea of being a martyr to the cause. If I die, what a better way to go than in service of my beloved League. So they couldn't stop him. All they could do was go with him and try to save him from his own worst self. So at the end of August 1919, they all get on a train together, and it's even worse than they imagined, because they thought he might get some rest between stops. But of course, what happens, right? A local politician gets on in his town and says, I'll just ride with you to the next town and tell you about my local project, right? So he's getting no rest at all. He starts to develop headaches so severe that he is literally blind. The train tour went sort of through the northern Midwest, out to Spokane, down the west coast to LA, and was doubling back up through the Rocky Mountains when the president suffered a stroke, collapses on the train. He still thought he could go on. Edith and Grayson and Tumulty knew he absolutely could not. The train tour is canceled. The train comes steaming back to Washington. This is now end of September 1919. He was okay enough as he's getting off the train at Union Station in Washington to wave to the crowds. That was the last time anyone would see him for 6 months. Because he got back to the White House and in early October suffered a massive stroke. His whole left side was paralyzed. Oh, I'm going in and out of the microphone. His whole left side was paralyzed. He found it very hard to concentrate. He would lose the thread of a conversation. He slept a lot. His life really was in the balance for the first week. But even after he was in out of mortal danger, he was a really, really sick man. And there's a lot of conversation in retrospect, the kind of medical diagnosis 100 years later, saying, was his brain sharp? Was he capable of making decisions? It actually doesn't matter, because the treatment for stroke at the time was to be kept very quiet. And you were told you couldn't face any stress, and you couldn't make hard decisions. Well, what does a president do all day, right? But face stress and make hard decisions. And so in Edith's telling, and again, unreliable narrator, she says the doctors came to her and said, if he does everything he was elected to do, if he's actually president, he's going to die. But he can't quit, because the only thing keeping him alive is this dream of the League of Nations. So if he resigns, he has no incentive to approve. So if he's president, he dies, and if he quits, he dies. And P.S., if he dies, maybe there's never world peace. That's the stakes. So the only available option, First Lady Edith Wilson, is to do his job for him until he's better enough to do it himself. That's preposterous, right? We have someone whose job it is to step in when the president cannot be president. Anyone here know who Woodrow Wilson's vice president was?
Marshall.
Thomas Marshall.
Wow, you all are the first audience who actually knew. Well done. He was a completely forgettable guy named Thomas Marshall. He was added to the ticket for, Indiana's electoral votes. He wrote a memoir. They all wrote memoirs. Everyone in this administration wrote a memoir. His is called A Hoosier Salad. It's just as weird as it sounds. He was kind of a court jester. He was full of quippy one-liners. He was a little bit of a clown, and he wanted no part of the presidency. And the 25th Amendment didn't exist. And so the mechanism by which a vice president stepped in when a president was incapacitated was very blurry. Did they become president? Did they become acting president? Who declared the president incompetent? How did that all work? And so not only did Marshall not want to be president, he really didn't want to be seen as illegitimately usurping power. So Marshall was never told how sick the president was, because Edith, Tumulty, and Grayson circled the wagons. And they lied to everybody. They lied to the press, to the public, to the cabinet, to the Congress. They lied to the president himself. He never knew how sick he was. And I get asked all the time, during that time when Edith was acting as the executive, did she change history? Did she, go rogue or do something that he would not have done? And the answer is probably no. She knew his mind quite well, and she wasn't Lady Macbeth. She was there really to just keep a placeholder. But she claimed that she was taking every decision to him. Someone would come and ask for a meeting, and she'd say, let me check with the president. She clearly was not taking every decision to him. But even if she were, his judgment was terrible, because he wasn't hearing any bad news, because they were keeping him in an echo chamber. And so even if he was making decisions, he was making decisions based on terrible information, because they weren't telling him the truth. He was so deluded that he considered running for a third term in 1920, which not only would he never have survived, he never would have won. The nation was over it. They were over the sacrifices of World War I. They were over Woodrow Wilson when Warren Harding was elected in an absolute landslide in 1920. The only American voter who was surprised was President Woodrow Wilson. He thought Americans were still out there waiting for the League of Nations. The U.S. never ratified that treaty. Next picture. So you may be wondering, why didn't anybody ask questions about this particular situation? Why was it that Edith was able to act as the executive from October 2nd, when he had a stroke? He was not seen in public until April. April. Well, questions were asked, maybe not as rapidly as they would be today, but by spring, the press started saying, if he's okay, let us see him. And if he's not okay, we need to know that. So they put him in a car and trucked him around town. They had to find a cape-style coat because his left side was still paralyzed, so he couldn't get an arm through a sleeve. And he was kind of tippy. So they wedged him in the corner of the car in this Weekend at Bernie's moment. And you can see how concerned Edith and Dr. Grayson are looking. And they drove him around town so that people could see that he was, in fact, still alive. He didn't give any statements. He didn't answer any questions. Amazingly, once word started to get out that Edith was the one who was acting as executive, not all the news coverage was negative. There were articles saying, isn't it wonderful what she's doing? Wouldn't it be nice to have such a loyal wife? Which was astounding to me. But as it happened, Warren Harding did win election in 1920. And then the Wilsons needed to figure out where to live. They didn't have a house. Wilson had never had a house. He lived at Princeton, and she had sold that pretty DuPont Circle townhouse when she married him. And in her memoir, she made a chart of different cities and rated them on different assets. And Washington actually scored lowest in that chart because the privacy score was 0. But they decided to stay in Washington anyway because it was her home, and she knew he was dying. She knew that she was going to be a widow for much longer than they were married, and she wanted to be in Washington. So when the Hardings came in, at the time inauguration was March 4th, and Edith describes that in her memoir. She did not like Florence Harding. She called her voluble and highly rouged. So they decided to stay in Washington. They bought a house in the Calorama neighborhood. They were the first couple to do that, since then the Obamas had done it. In fact, their house is right down the street. And in her memoir, it's amazing. From like the moment they leave the White House, she starts calling him an invalid. She starts being completely frank about how weak he was and how close to death. That was 1921. He died at the very beginning of 1924. She lived till 1961. Wow. What did she do with all that time? Let's see what the next picture is. Oh, this is the picture that is the cover of a lot of books. So this, when the press started asking questions, they got a sort of friendly magazine writer to do a feature. And this was a photo that was taken to accompany that feature. She's holding that paper steady for him to be able to sign it. Next slide. So from 1924 to 1961, she largely, well, I mean, she went back to being a fabulous wealthy widow about town, and she went back to, going to Europe every year for clothes and wearing great hats and jewelry. She had every incoming first lady to tea, regardless of party, to basically say, I know the job's crazy, you've got a friend in me. But what she mainly did was curate his memory. She showed up at everything. Every time someone was naming something after him, unveiling a statue, commemorating him in any way, she was there controlling the narrative. And it's been really interesting to me, as we've been sort of revisiting Wilson's legacy. The college I lived in at Princeton my freshman and sophomore year is no longer Wilson College, right? We've been taking his name off things. The image we are rethinking, that visionary of global peace, was so much a myth of Edith's making. She was the one out there making sure that is how he was remembered. This picture is just before she died in 1961, and President Kennedy is handing her the pen he used to sign the legislation creating a Wilson Memorial. They decided that the Wilson Memorial would be a living memorial, not a statue, and so the Wilson Center, the think tank, is the Wilson Memorial. And the legislation authorizing that is what he's signing and handing her the pen. That was fall of 61, and she died that December. And so that is Edith's story, and we are right on time to have some questions. Is there a Q&A microphone next that we should be paying attention to? Stand by, the microphone is coming to you. I think there was a question right here on the audio.
Yeah, sure.
That's okay.
Yeah, just bring.
Wait, a question right here, second row on the aisle.
Hi, did she remain active in any aspect of politics within either the Democratic Party or in any other broader sphere during those 40 years?
Did you all hear the question? Did she remain active in politics? So, not publicly. She did show up at the 1928 Democratic Convention because she was sort of the grande dame of the last Democratic presidency at that point, right? And she endorsed Al Smith, which she made some snarky anti-Catholic comments in her memoir, especially about Joe Tumulty, and so the fact that she endorsed Al Smith maybe means she, growth happens. That is the only public speech she ever made, was at the 1928 Democratic Convention, and there was a little boom to try to have her on the ticket as the franchise nationwide in 1920, in part because Wilson dragged his feet so long in the 19th Amendment. There was a lot of fear that those new women voters would be Republican. And so she wanted no part of it. She didn't accept in any way, but it's interesting that only 8 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified. There was some talk about adding a woman to the ticket. She, was invited to things and showed up, but she never made speeches. On the 100th anniversary of his birth, there was a lot of commemorative stuff. It was not particularly partisan, except to the degree that it was a Democratic president. So the short answer is no. And that is how she was able to say with a straight face that she was not political. But if you read her mail, that's garbage. Other questions?
I'm hiding right behind the pillar.
Oh, hi.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the talk that she was growing up in the milieu of the Lost Cause and that sort of myth in the South developing in the Reconstruction period. And since we know nowadays that Wilson is such a big promoter of the Lost Cause, showing the birth of the nation in the White House, promoting it at Princeton, do we know her thoughts on her husband's views of the Lost Cause and the state of race relations at the time, that resegregating the federal government, the riots taking place in 1919, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So she was a bigot. I mean, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She was an unreconstructed Confederate. Her memoir, which she wrote in 1939, has language in it that she uses the term darky. It's bad. She talks about how her family's slaves were happy and delighted to be enslaved and didn't know what to do with their freedom. There's no way to spin that as anything other than racist, right? In terms of her relations with Wilson about that, as you mentioned, the sort of two big tent poles in the evidence of Wilson was a racist are resegregating the civil service and screening birth of the nation at the White House. Both of those happened before they were married, so she was not involved in those incidents specifically. But their sort of shared view of the inferiority of blacks, there's no question that exists.
From what I've read, Wilson was not exactly active in endorsing the suffrage and suffragette movement. Where did she stand, if at all, when it came to the right for women to vote, especially since she was such a strong woman? I'm just curious as to where she was.
Yeah, this was actually why I started writing about Edith. So when I was giving talks about suffrage, especially around the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, people kept asking me, did Wilson change his mind? Because he had been dragging his feet, right? Did he finally come on board for the 19th Amendment because she whispered in his ear? And I was getting the question predictably enough that I started reading up on her to know how to answer it. And I discovered that she was anti-suffrage. He came around to the 19th Amendment for reasons entirely of electoral math. And it kills me, right? Why is this business-owning, car-driving, independent, confident woman not interested in exercising her rights as a citizen? And as far as she never said why, she does say in her memoir that once it got to 1917 and the National Women's Party was picketing the White House, and very directly criticizing Wilson, she hated that. Right? She didn't like anybody criticizing him. She hated that tactic. It was tacky and offensive and unfeminine. But she was on record being anti-suffrage before the 1917 Silent Sentinels. There's a moment in her memoir when she goes to Europe, and she often traveled with a woman named Altrude Gordon, who was Carrie Grayson's girlfriend. And Altrude brought a cousin who was kind of one of those grouchy tourists who likes to go to foreign countries just to say how much better America is, right? And he had never been to the Tower of London, and she had. So she made Altrude take him through the Tower of London because she wasn't interested in seeing it again, and she sat out front. And this is now 1913. And guards came and made her move because the Pankhurst wing of the British suffragists were starting their guerrilla militant tactics. And a woman, even a well-dressed white woman, sitting with a purse that might have an explosive in it at a landmark was suspect. And she was so undone by being suspected of anything. And I don't know if that shaped her view of the movement or whether, I don't know why she retold that story in her memoir. I do think there was just kind of a classist, there's something not nice about being out in the public sphere. And that was an argument that plenty of anti-suffrage women made, right? That women owned the domestic sphere and we should be proud of that, and wanting to muck around in the dirty public sphere, the world of men, was denigrating the importance of the private sphere. It's the same argument you heard against the ERA a generation later. But to be fair, if she had wanted social cover for being pro-suffrage, she could have had it. There were plenty of fancy society ladies who were suffragists, including Daisy Harriman, who was in Wilson's administration. So, I don't know, it kills me. It kills me that she was anti-suffrage, but she was. There was reason to believe that Jill was making sure he was not in a position where his flaws were exposed. The scope is just night and day. It's very different to make sure that only friendly reporters ask a question at a press conference, or that the president is not going up and down steep steps, in danger of stumbling, or something that makes the optics safer, than the president not being seen for 6 months and the first lady doing all of the executive branching that was going on. It's just a difference of scale that really can't be compared. I do think that instinct to protect the man and, kind of democracy be damned, is the same instinct. I think that's what you've seen with all the examples you mentioned. That they loved their husbands, and they wanted their husbands to project their best selves to the American public. And sometimes that meant lying to the American public. But the scope of what Edith did is just unprecedented. I think there was a question over here, whoever's the microphone. Oh, hi Mel.
Me and Steve are arguing about who gets to ask you. And I apologize if you had already gone through this in the beginning, but what drew you to write a whole book about Edith? Like, there's a lot. I know you focus on women, which is fabulous in politics, but what sparked you to write a whole book about her?
So, because you know me, Mel, you will know this answer is true. So when I was doing research on her to answer those suffrage questions, there is a recent biography of her that is sexist garbage, and it made me furious. First of all, it talks about the size of her boobs 3 or 4 different times in this book. It's also really poorly written, where verb tense changes in the middle of a sentence. And so there were so many things that made me mad about that book that I actually kind of in a rage put together a proposal for my agent. So that was part of it. But also I feel really strongly that, and forgive me for getting on my high horse for a minute about this, but if we reduce history to heroes and villains, right? And we only have perfect once-in-a-generation geniuses and, irredeemably evil actors. First of all, that's just bad history, right? That's not how history gets made. That's not how humans exist. But also, it makes it really hard to see yourself in history. These people were people. It is okay for them to have flaws. It is okay for them to make mistakes and be slow to learn and do things that disappoint you 100 years hence. Because that makes them real people, and it means that we all, in all of our flaws, are also capable of making history. We don't have to be once-in-a-generation geniuses. And so Edith, for all of her warts and all, is a fascinating story. And I didn't want to pick one of those, 3 stock characters I described at the beginning. I wanted her to be a 3D person. And that's why I wrote the book. Thank you for asking. Back here.
I was wondering, how did she do as stepmom? And
Yeah.
how did his daughters work with her or not with her at his legacy?
So the daughters, in public, they said all the right things, right? Even though their mom had just died. They said, we're happy, our dad is happy, we want him to be happy, 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 happy. In private, and their letters all exist too, they griped about her a fair amount to each other. And they thought her family was kind of awful, and but in public, everyone was nice to each other. There was a break. So I mentioned that Nell, the youngest daughter, married Wilson's Secretary of Defense. And that guy, William McAdoo, kind of expected to be the heir apparent. He was in the cabinet, he was literally the son-in-law. And when Wilson considered running for a third term in 1920, in his delusion, he hesitated to endorse anyone because he thought he might still be president. And so William McAdoo kind of didn't have the chance to win the nomination in 1920 because he held back because his father-in-law was dragging his feet. So then when Wilson died, right at the beginning of 1924, McAdoo thought, now's my moment, it's an election year. And when he and Nell came to the house in Kalorama to greet all the mourners and help plan the funeral, he was campaigning. And he was meeting with Wilson's advisors to talk about his own campaign for 24. And Edith was furious, absolutely furious, that McAdoo was campaigning during a funeral, that Nell was letting it happen, that she was putting his political ambitions over mourning her own father, and so they had quite a split. Both the other daughters, Jessie and Margaret, died quite young, and so when that centennial of Wilson's birth, so many ceremonies were going on, it was Edith and Nell on all those daises together. And in public, they managed to, smile and do all the right things because they were good politicians, but they never healed that rift.
I don't know if we need a microphone, can I just talk loud?
I think they're recording it, so they want you to talk into a microphone so that it's recorded. Yeah.
I was just curious to know if you could tell us about, so after now Edith is a widow again, she's on her own, how does she do during the Great Depression?
Yeah, so here's the frustrating thing. Her memoir ends the day he died. She wrote more chapters, but the publisher didn't think anybody would want to read them. I have read them because the people at Whitfield let me see them. There is no real substance. It was a privilege to get some more of her voice and understand her a little bit better, but there's not a lot of detail about what her life was like. They never had a super comfortable financial cushion. Former presidents didn't get a pension at the time. They were only able to buy that Kalorama house because of the Nobel Peace Prize money, and Bernard Baruch helping out. So she continued to own Galt's until the 20s. And she had some investment income, and she was very, very frugal. That childhood in Whitfield stood her in good stead. She was constantly remaking her fancy gowns into a new fashion with the stitching her grandmother had taught her and things like that. So she was just very practical and kind of made it through. But I think had she been a different kind of woman, used to a different level of disposable income, it might have been different. She did hang on to Galt's, the store, and did ultimately let the staff who managed it buy her out. So she was the last member of the Galt family to own it. The store didn't close until 2002. So specifically to the Depression, I don't know the answer in terms of exactly how she survived. Her great nephew, who is in his 80s and is a lovely guy and was very helpful for this book, talks about her still being quite grand through his whole childhood. So I don't know if that's the perception of a child and, blinded by the furs or whatever, but yeah.
Hi, Becca.
Hi, Steve. That's my
So
cousin
sort of
Steve.
related to that, the answer to that question, 50 years from now,
somebody like you wants to write a book like this about Jill Biden, maybe Vic was talking about, and all the communication now is electronic, and there's no letters, there's no diaries, maybe she writes a memoir, but that's it. How does somebody do it? You're a historian, I guess.
I mean, I think there's good news and bad news, right? There's probably less personal correspondence unless people have saved their emails and texts. But there is so much more press scrutiny, and so many more, so much more of her personal voice, right? She's much more accessible. It's absolutely expected that every First Lady gives regular interviews, champions regular causes, hosts events. So I think the sourcing will be different for historians of the future and less reliant on letters, but more reliant on public sources. I also think that one of the reasons I had to rely so much on letters is because people weren't keeping documents about women. And some of that is just garden variety sexism, but some of it is the women themselves playing down their role and pretending it was all the man in the room. And that, of course, is changing. And so women are taking credit for the work they do more now than ever. It's still not perfect, but so Steve and I are first cousins. Our grandmother was a member of Congress, and she was very much of this mold. She was an incredibly accomplished, savvy politician, and one of her mottos was, "You can get anything done if you don't need the credit for it." Right? Which is really politically astute, but also incredibly female. And she spent a lot of time letting the men in the room take the credit for it. And that's how she got her priorities passed through legislation. And I don't know that women are doing that much anymore, right? So we don't need to rely on these private sources to tell their story because they're telling it more themselves. So it's a trade-off.
I have a question about the media during
Yeah.
Edith's reign. Why were they so incurious and so not pushy?
Right? I had this question myself. So I think it's a couple of things. First of all, there wasn't like a White House press corps in the way we think of it now. There weren't people who were covering that beat day in, day out, at the White House all the time, cultivating sources in the executive branch. There certainly wasn't a 24-hour news cycle. And there was a kind of gentleman's agreement to not pry too much into people's private lives, right? And they were gentlemen. I mean, they were all men. They weren't necessarily gentlemen. There were also a lot of people for whom sustaining the myth that the Wilson administration was strong and active worked for them, right? Like that, all the members of the cabinet weren't going to come out publicly and say, Wilson's really sick and we're not having any meetings and nobody's doing any work. So there were plenty of critics, and they did talk to the press. There were reporters who started to dig, and as I said, they weren't all critical. But even the most sort of explosive, there was a senator from New Mexico named Albert Fall who stood up on the floor of the Senate and said, "We have a petticoat government, Mrs. Wilson is acting," and everyone was sort of like, so it just wasn't the bombshell that he expected it to be. And I'm not totally sure why, but it really did astound me how little the press pushed for it until they did. They kind of let it happen for a few months, and then they did start to push in like March, April of 1920. But that's months later.
We have time for one more question.
So I actually have kind of a couple of questions. I'll just squeeze them in quickly. First, when you were saying earlier, I found it interesting when you said that when Edith took over for her husband, that people were saying like, "Oh wow, isn't this amazing?" And I thought you were going to say, "Isn't it amazing that this woman is doing this great job?" And instead you said, "Isn't it amazing that she's so loyal to her husband?" And I was like, "Oh."
Yep.
Like, when are we going to get past that? And be excited that a woman is doing a great job. The other thing that I just wanted to make a point about is that there's a Benjamin Moore Colonial Williamsburg paint color called gold blue that is not dissimilar to the color of the walls in this room.
Huh.
And I says that it is named for an 18th century interior paint color found by researchers in the Galt dining room, giving it a graceful vintage quality, which I would say describes this room.
There you go.
Do you know what they're referring to?
I don't. The Galts were around. Norman's grandfather started the store in Old Town Alexandria before DC existed. They moved into DC in like 1802 and immediately became the purveyors to the White House. So Thomas Jefferson bought a tea service there. Mary Todd Lincoln, who was accused of overspending and running up debts, bought all kinds of stuff there. And in fact, by then the store was run by Norman's father, and he, after the assassination, forgave most of her debts. So they were very much knit into the White House. Their house itself was not particularly grand, so I don't know if it's the same Galt or if there's any connection, but there were certainly colonial Galts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it.